Tell me, what's the most surprising thing to you so far in the Israel-Iran conflict?
I think for years I have been trying to explain to people that the Iranian state and its security apparatus are pretty brittle and porous. And there's been this perception for years in the US in particular, but also among the Iranian public that it is this massive, well oiled machine. It's not. I could have told you from my own experience sitting in prison there that these are not geniuses. But the extent to which they have been owned by the IDF and Mossad maybe shouldn't be a surprise, but is a big surprise to everyone.
This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show that brings you conversations about the news we can't stop thinking about, even though we have removed all the televisions from our homes. I'm Dana Milbank, and this week we're talking about the sudden hostilities between Israel and Iran. Last Friday, Israel attacked Iran, killing top military leaders and damaging nuclear sites. Iran has retaliated with missile attacks on Israel, which has expanded its targets in Iran. There's no sign of things calming down. The Israeli attack derailed nuclear talks the Trump administration was having with Iran, and President Trump is now hoping the attacks will provide leverage to extract more concessions from Iran. At the same time, Trump says he'd like to see, quote, a real end to the matter rather than a ceasefire. But Trump and Secretary of State Rubio have pointedly said they have no role in Israel's attacks and no plans to get involved unless Iran strikes U.S. forces in the region. So what role should the United States be playing in this conflict, and how do American interests align with or conflict with Israel's? To sort all this out, I'm joined by two colleagues with extensive knowledge of the region to discuss all of this. Would you both please introduce yourselves?
I'm Jason Rezaian. I am currently the director of press freedom initiatives here at the Washington Post. Previously, I was an opinions columnist, and before that, I was our Tehran bureau chief for several years before getting locked up by the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and held for 544 days.
And I'm Keith Richburg. I'm an editorial writer and columnist for the Washington Post. I spent 35 years with the Washington Post. I first joined as a summer intern and spent most of my time as a foreign correspondent based in Southeast Asia, Africa, Hong Kong, China, Paris, covering Europe, and also covered a lot of the Middle East. And now I'm writing editorials and occasional columns.
And I'm Dana Milbank, and I don't know anything compared to these guys. But thank you both for joining me. So, all right, Israel has attacked Iran's nuclear facilities before, and it has been threatening another attack like this for a long time. Why did Netanyahu decide this was the moment?
I think my perception of it, going back to October 7th and all that's happened since, Israel's been pretty methodical in taking out the infrastructure of Hamas, Hezbollah. But in the background, people call it a shadow war, but I don't think it was a shadow war. It's been out in the public for a long time. But, taking out Iranian generals in Syria and in Lebanon, taking out nuclear scientists, going back more than a decade. This isn't new. What's new is the kind of concentrated nature of it on Iranian soil in a prolonged, days-long manner. And I think it speaks to just how disciplined and professional the Israeli forces are in comparison to really anybody else in the region, but especially the Iranians. So it was an opportunity. Mm-hmm. The Islamic Republic is probably at its weakest state since the end years of the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq in the 80s. And I think they sensed an opportunity to disrupt.
Yeah. And your view is we're not seeing more of a response from Iran because this is all they got.
This is all they've got. I don't believe that they have more firepower. Yeah. I was talking to a long-time high-level national security official in the U.S., and Iran's going to run out of missiles in a couple of days.
Keith?
Yeah, I would agree that this was a window of opportunity for Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. Mm-hmm. And I would call this kind of the unintended consequence of the Hamas attack of October 7th. I mean, that was a horrific attack, a terrorist attack on Israel. But Bibi Netanyahu saw that as an opening to not only, move in beyond what many of us thought was necessary to not only decimate Hamas, but decimate a huge chunk of Gaza. But he also saw this as an opportunity to do what he always wanted to do, which is really try to decimate Hezbollah in South Lebanon. And they started out with this pager operation, the exploding pagers and the exploding walkie-talkies that decimated the middle management of Hezbollah.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think something that Israel was not directly involved in, but which fed into this, was the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, one of the most virulent anti-Israel regimes in the region there. So, Hamas is on the back foot. Hezbollah is basically decapitated and decimated. And then the Assad regime falls in Syria. And I think, Netanyahu, he just saw this, especially with the Trump administration in the White House, which was probably not going to put a red light on this kind of activity. And I think he just said, let's just go straight after the Tehran regime. A few months ago, they decimated their air defenses, so they knew that they could basically control the airspace, at least from Western Iran over to Tehran. And like Jason said, they're going to run out of missiles.
Yeah. So this looked at first like sort of a decapitation strike and hitting the nuclear facilities. Now looks broader with the Israeli warnings for people to vacate part of Tehran. Jason, if it's okay to say so, you know an awful lot of people on the ground over there. How is this affecting life for ordinary people?
I think that that's the missing piece in all of this. You talked about Israeli warnings, and if you turn on any of the cable news right now, you'll see live shots from bunkers in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and other cities in Israel, and the advanced warning systems that people get on through SMS on their cell phones. In Iran, they don't have any of that, right? There is no warning system. My wife, who was a small child during the Iran-Iraq war, talked about the bombing warnings from that time. None of that exists right now.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a city of 14 million people, the vast majority of which live in high rises, right? These are very flammable targets that we've seen devastated in recent days. I mean, I guess the good news is that Israeli missiles seem to be very precise and they hit their targets. The bad news is if there's a general living, on the 17th floor of a 20-floor building, there's going to be a lot of collateral loss. And we're seeing that. And I'll tell you, Dana, I mean, relatives of my wife and mine, folks who have enjoyed Shabbat dinner in your house, are trapped in their apartment in Tehran right now. So this is very real for millions of people. If you see the images of folks trying to escape Tehran at the moment, the traffic on the highways is endless, and a lot of people don't have anywhere to go.
Let us talk a bit about the long term. So Israel had said Iran's uranium enrichment is a threat to its existence. Trump says the threat was imminent, but U.S. intelligence seems to think it was maybe not so immediate. What do you guys think Netanyahu's endgame is? Is it destroying nuclear capacity, delaying it? Is it regime change? Or, as I've feared sometimes with this current Israeli government, is there no real thought about what's going to happen in the long term, only what might work in the short term? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I would say, Dana, that look, I think it's regime change. And I think that the short term goal is to try to strike as much of the nuclear weapons capability as they can. They can't get it all because so much of it, especially at the Fordo place, it's buried deep underground. It's supposed to be a half a kilometer underground inside a mountain.
Mm.
Only the American, MOP, the massive ordnance penetrator bomb can burrow that deep in, and that's got to be delivered by a B-2. The Israelis don't have that bomb. They don't have that plane to carry the bomb. And so it's not a secret. Netanyahu and the generals have openly said, we want America to join us. Come please help us. Help us do this and finish the job. So the initial thing they want is to disrupt the ballistic missiles, which, again, they don't have to do much because Iran is firing most of them. And they want to be able to, deal with the nuclear weapons capability. They don't want to just disrupt it like they did last time by bombing the surface. They want to destroy it entirely. That was the whole purpose of taking out the actual nuclear scientists. But Netanyahu seems to be hinting at and making no secret about the fact that he would love to see the regime change. I mean, otherwise, there's no particular reason why they're bombing police stations and bombing the radio stations and bombing, oil infrastructure and doing all kinds of other things. And look, it's not out of the realm of possibility. I wouldn't bet on it, but look, I didn't bet on the Assad regime falling in Syria as rapidly as it did as well.
Yeah.
So things tend to happen rapidly in the Middle East. And again, I'm not betting on it, but I mean, Iranians have been hearing, for decades now since the revolution, this chant of death to Israel, death to America, this and that. And all of a sudden, the Iranian people are seeing that this is a paper tiger. They couldn't even protect the capital city. They couldn't protect their own generals. They couldn't protect their own nuclear scientists. Israel has control of the skies. I mean, obviously, there's going to be some anger generated towards Israel. Nobody wants to see their country bombed by another country. But it's also got to generate some anger towards the ruling regime to say you couldn't even protect us in our own country, in our own homes. Those people who are fleeing on the highway that Jason talked about, they've got to have some residual anger towards this regime that spends a lot of time, locking up girls for not wearing a headscarf, or locking up men for various moral offenses, but they couldn't even protect their own skies. We've seen some uprisings before. We saw one during the Obama demonstration. It didn't go anywhere, but we have seen the people are desperately angry. They don't like this regime, and this is not going to help.
Yeah, there's not a lot of support for this regime at this point, but I'd take it a step further. I wouldn't necessarily call it trying for regime change, but more regime annihilation. The problem with that is there isn't an alternative that's well-baked waiting in the wings, right? There is the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, which is a kind of a cult organization that is guilty of taking out thousands of Iranians in terror attacks inside the country and in other places in the world. There is a group of people who want to see a reestablishment of the pre-Islamic Republic monarchy, the one that, people fought so hard to remove in the first place.
Right.
But the reality is that none of these groups have had a foothold on the ground in Iran for 46 years. And, those of us who watch the country closely have come to the conclusion that if you want to have a new system, it's going to have to grow organically. And the one thing that this regime has been really good at over the years is snuffing out any sort of organic domestic opposition. Even right now, even with these bombs raining down on Tehran, they're still arresting journalists. They're arresting people who are talking about what's happening in the streets, people who are posting on social media, women who aren't wearing hijab. They're doing exactly those same things. And so, my fear, and I think the fear that's shared with a lot of people I'm talking with, is that, to Keith's point, the support for the regime has diminished drastically. I don't think it was ever overwhelming. It's always been a minority of people. But the people who do support it are the ones that have the guns. And I fear that when the missiles stop, the situation would be ripe for civil war, like we've seen in other places where we or our allies have toppled systems.
Right. So Israel could wind up neutralizing a threat in the short term and creating an entirely different threat in the long term.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you look at Syria as an example, I don't think Israel particularly cares what government comes to power in Syria after Assad, because their economy is so devastated. They've got so much work to do that they're not going to be a threat to Israel for the next decade. I think they wouldn't mind the same thing in Iran. I mean, they would love. I love Jason's term at regime annihilation. They'd love to annihilate this regime, but they don't really care what comes next, because they'll be, if they're damaging the oil infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, their economy, then whatever regime emerges, or even if the regime survives, it will be so consumed with domestic problems that they're not going to be busy chanting, death to Israel.
Yeah, even if it's a humanitarian catastrophe.
I also want to point out that at the moment, those couple of thousand missiles that Iran had up until a few days ago, as we've seen, can reach Israel. Once those are gone, they don't have that capability. They're no longer an aerial threat to Israeli territory. But, I think all of this is very short-sighted. We have a country in Iran that, by every estimation, forget about the, chance of death to Israel and death to America. It's the most pro-American population of people in surveys pretty much anywhere in the world. And as someone who lived there for many years, this is a country where, made in America has more resonance than it does here, right? Because, the folks of Iran are more familiar with American products of the 1960s than they are of the current crap that that we put out. So, maybe there's a chance for us to sell some cars and jeans and Coca-Cola, and that might be a better way out of this mess than bombing people.
All right. After the break, we're going to talk about how the United States plays into all this. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. I'm Dana Milbank, and this is Impromptu. Before the break, we were talking about Israel's endgame. Can Israel achieve those goals, whatever they are, without the United States? I also wonder, do you think there's a danger that the bipartisan support Israel has enjoyed for the last 75 years is now at risk of disappearing? So if you could try to tackle both of those notions.
I mean, look, it always was fraying, I think, up until now, because you saw the Democratic left, particularly like people like Bernie Sanders, et cetera, and, with the on the left side in the Democratic Party and the progressives, you saw the divest movement, divest from Israel, et cetera. So that's a split within the Democratic Party. You still have people like Chuck Schumer and Andrew Cuomo, running for mayor in New York, who are very, very staunchly pro-Israel. But you've also got people like AOC and Bernie Sanders who are saying, this has to stop, and feeling more in tune with the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza, et cetera. So that split's been there. It's interesting to me to look at what's happening in the Republican Party, which is basically the Trump Party now, because you've got some people saying, we got to, Lindsey Graham, we got to go in there and help. Israel needs our bunker buster bombs, and we got to get in there, and we have a chance to topple the Iranian regime. Let's get in there and do it. And you've got other people, the MAGA populists, maybe the Tucker Carlsons of the world, and others saying, are you insane? Then let's not get involved. And I think Trump is really torn with this one. Just to add something here, I think it's fascinating. All of these thousands of missiles, or at least hundreds at this point, that Iran has tossed at Israel, they have not sent anything towards a U.S. military base or a U.S. military asset. And I think that's deliberate on their part. They don't want to give America or Trump any pretext to come in.
Now, Jason, you're probably on a lot of signal chats with the Trump National Security team. Yeah. Which of Trump's instincts prevail here? Keep us out of wars or be the tough guy, strike a deal or...
Yeah, I think his instinct is strike a deal if he can. My sense is that the Israelis gave some warning, but that there was some real belief within the U.S. government that they weren't actually going to do it, right? Because he definitely didn't want them to. And the fact that they'd had 5 rounds of negotiations with Iran on the nuclear issue felt like progress to him, right? Like he wants to get that done. And I know that the Iranians are sending messages across saying, hey, when the dust settles, forget about what they're saying publicly, right? When the bombs stop, we want to keep talking, right? And, I think getting human rights into any negotiated settlement with Iran is paramount. I don't think that that's where the thinking of this administration is at all. And it wasn't part of the negotiations that the Obama administration had with Iran 10 years ago. So the Iranian people lose again and again. I have one idea that I think is worth mentioning, very America first. We hear about the thousands, tens of thousands of U.S. citizens, maybe hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens that live in Israel and all that we're prepared to do to help them. We never even consider the fact that there are thousands upon the thousands of U.S. citizens and green card holders living in Tehran right now. And I think one thing that the President Trump could push for right now with both the Iranians and the Israelis is a safe exit for U.S. nationals that want to get out of harm's way. And I think that's a missing piece of the equation that isn't being talked about, isn't being thought about, and could open up the door to some conversations.
Yes, hear, hear. Do you guys think Can Israel go it alone? I mean, they can't finish off Iran without the nuclear program, without the bunker busters here, but also in the long run, I just wonder if they're, winning tactical victories here and then isolating themselves in the long run. But can they prevail going along the path they've been going on?
One of the biggest unstudied or factors in international relations or politics is humiliation. And a country that's been humiliated, look, Iran might be decimated by this, but what are you doing to a generation 10 years from now that's going to come back? I mean, I was surprised during the Iranian Revolution of 79 and then since how people still talk about how the CIA overthrew a democratically elected leader in the 1950s. And people still talk about that,
Yeah.
I mean, the Palestinians still talk about their humiliation because of the expulsion, et cetera. So Israel can win this round easily. It's obviously the biggest power by far in the Middle East. But Colin Powell used to talk about the pottery barn rule. We were attacking Iraq the first time for the invasion of Kuwait. You broke it, you bought it. They could end up breaking, annihilating the regime, regime annihilation. But then Israel's kind of responsible for that. And the other thing is, you talked about Israel's long-term impact on Israel itself. The other thing is they're losing a lot of their support in Europe, which I find absolutely fascinating. Europe and Canada, I think, were among the others. And you could end up seeing Israel being tactically, militarily successful in what they've done in South Lebanon, what they're doing with Gaza,
Yes.
what they're doing in Iran right now. But they could end up losing the support they've always had from some of their staunchest allies. And if those countries, they've talked about it, I'm not sure it's going to happen anytime soon, but if they turn around and recognize a Palestinian state or start withholding some weapons or support from Israel, that could be a long-term problem that was a consequence of this short-term military success.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think. Now, it's well known that Trump's national security team gets most of its military advice from listening to Impromptu. So help them out, gentlemen. What should the United States be doing? Staying on the sidelines, bringing in the big bombers? I mean, let's stipulate that what Jason was talking about with safe passage and the humanitarian should be done regardless of what the military response is. But what do you think is the right move here?
To me, it's stay out of this. I think that this was a war of choice by Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's got to own that.
Yeah, I agree. Look, Israel picked the timing of this thing. There were talks that were supposed to start on Sunday, so Israel attacked on a Saturday. And look, as long as Iran has restrained itself so far, they have not directly attacked any U.S. military bases or any U.S. military assets. I think the U.S. needs to stay out of this. And I do think the U.S. needs to help bolster Israel's defenses on the incoming missiles. They are our ally, and we've done that before. If their interceptors are running out because they're shooting down a lot of these things, the U.S. probably needs to reinforce that. But I don't think direct attacks on Iran would be in anybody's interest. The other thing is I don't think it would have public support. No. I don't think the U.S. public is interested in getting involved in another Middle Eastern war that we didn't start.
Well, this has been really a wonderful conversation, and we do have to wrap it up. Jason, if you can reach family members in Tehran, please tell them I'm praying for them, and indeed I'm praying for this whole thing to be over as soon as possible. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me on Impromptu.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. I hope all of your relatives and friends are safe in that region.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson and Regina DeHeer, edited by Damir Marusic, and mixed by Emma Munger. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Thanks for listening to Impromptu. Please let us know what you think about what's going on in the Middle East. Send an email to impromptu@washpost.com. And be sure to keep tuning in every Tuesday and Friday to hear myself and other Washington Post columnists unpack the biggest news and cultural events of the moment.